Welcome back to Business Economics. I'm Professor Phil Tomlinson, and in this session we're going to explore the concept of barriers to entry and barriers to exit to markets. We'll explain what they are, consider why they're important before considering some of the most important natural and strategic barriers to entry. In essence, some of these entry barriers you've come across in earlier sessions, things such as sunk costs, brand loyalty and economies of scale. We'll cover these again, so this session is really a good opportunity to refresh your memory of some of these concepts. It's a little bit different today, since as you can see, I decided to shoot this video outside. Anyway, as usual, get yourself comfortable, grab a pen and a notepad and perhaps a drink as we go through the material. Before we begin, it is important to explain the significance of new entry into markets. Essentially, new entry into a market involves two things. First, it is the setting up of a new legal entity, such as a firm who acts as a producer in the marketplace. And second, that entity brings new productive capacity into the market. If the first condition doesn't hold, but the second condition does, then that's simply just investment in extra capacity by existing producers. For example, Tesla's new investment in a factory in Berlin. Tesla are already in the electric vehicle market, they're just bringing extra capacity to the European electrical vehicle market. If the second condition doesn't hold, but the first condition does hold, then that's simply an instance of a takeover or a merger such that the existing industry assets are being consolidated in a new legal entity. For example, the recent sale of the supermarket Asda by Walmart to TDR Capital brings no new capacity to the market. It simply transfers ownership from one legal entity to another. Why does entry into a market matter? Well, economists love to promote entry and reduce entry barriers because it should generate more competition in the marketplace. This new capacity should lead to downward pressure upon industry prices and firm profits. You can see this in the diagram, in which we assume a perfectly competitive market. New entry here leads to a shift in the supply schedule to S2 and lower prices in the market. Individual firms have to take a lower price on their demand curve D2 and accept lower profits. In equilibrium, given free entry, this equates to normal profits only. Go back and check your earlier notes on perfect competition if you are unsure. Before we consider actual barriers to entry, we should mention the idea of a market being contestable. This was an argument put forward by the late William Baumol back in 1982. Baumol argued that industrial economists had got it wrong, and we shouldn't really be worrying about actual competition and actual market structures, but rather potential competition and the ease by which new firms could enter a market. Baumol argued that so long as entry barriers were low, then even if there was only one or two firms in the market, these firms would have to behave as if they were competitive firms, and that the price would be equal to average costs, i.e. the price achieved under perfect competition. The idea is that incumbents have no advantage over potential entrants and are susceptible to hit and run entry if profit opportunities exist. i.e. entrants would enter and undercut existing incumbents and steal market share. If the incumbent reacts and price cutting subsequently leads to losses in the industry, then the entrant can easily exit. In its purest form, Baumol argued that in contestable markets there are no barriers to entry. This was quite a revolutionary idea, and Baumol suggested the airline industry as being a good example. At the time, the airline industry in the United States of America had been deregulated, and it was argued that airlines could easily enter profitable routes that flew across the USA. Why? Well, airlines did not have to buy planes, they could simply lease them, and they had access to slots from which to fly, which were opened up to competition. You might also think of bus routes as operating in a similar vein. Indeed, the UK used the contestable market theory to deregulate its own bus industry. More on that later. Baumol and his collaborators came in for a lot of criticism for this idea, and indeed, even in the airline industry, significant barriers to entry exist. For example, incumbent airlines often controlled computer reservation systems and airline bookings, and so they had an advantage over new entrants. Nevertheless, while contestable market theory may seem a bit far-fetched, it has changed our way of thinking about competition policy and the role of entry in markets. Today, we tend to talk about the degree of contestability rather than a market being purely contestable. So what are entry barriers? Well, for this, we need to go back to Sir George Bain, who did quite a lot of work on entry barriers in the 1950s. Essentially, a barrier to entry or exit is anything that prevents new firms entering or costlessly exiting the market, and thus allows incumbent firms to charge higher prices and make higher profits than would be the case under perfect competition. Following Bain, we can identify 4 natural types of entry barrier, and you will have come across some of these earlier in the semester. These are absolute cost advantages, economies of scale, product differentiation, and barriers to exit. We'll briefly go through these one by one. First, there are absolute cost advantages that are enjoyed by incumbent firms and protect them from entry. These absolute cost advantages allow incumbents to have lower average costs than potential rivals. These arise for several reasons. It may be that the incumbent owns patents or productive processes that allow them access to superior technology, or they may have access to cheaper or better quality raw materials. For instance, many supermarkets have established supply chains and suppliers which provide them with cheaper grocery sources. Or the incumbent may have access to cheaper finance, allowing them to fund investments more cheaply than potential rivals. It may also be the case that incumbents are vertically integrated firms. That means they conduct several stages of the production process within the firm. For example, Shell are involved in exploration, production, refinery, transportation, distribution and marketing of oil and petrol. This of course raises the cost of capital for new entrants. It is extremely difficult for new firms to enter the industry. Incumbents may also have control over distribution channels. Car manufacturers, for instance, control car dealerships and can decide which models are sold in their garages. Similarly, the big cereal manufacturers take up significant space in supermarket aisles. This is known as full line forcing. The second barrier is economies of scale. If incumbent firms can produce large volumes of output at low average cost per unit, then this is likely to bar entry. Recall from an earlier session, John Sutton's data showed that there are economies of scale in advertising expenditures, and this deters entry. Secondly, in the extreme case where there are declining average costs and increasing returns to scale, we might have a natural monopoly where the entire industry output can only feasibly be supplied by just one firm. A good example here is the local water company. The third barrier is where firms engage in product differentiation. Recall, this is a strategic weapon to create loyalty to established brands. This in turn imposes an extra cost upon potential new entrants, who will need to overcome such brand loyalty if they want to enter new markets, since consumers are often wary of trying new products, the quality of which they are uncertain. Incumbents, of course, use product differentiation to segment the market, i.e. to fill product space, which in turn reduces the space available for new entrants. Moreover, and related to this, advertising enhances brand loyalty, and this can make products price inelastic. Finally, there are barriers to exit. A barrier to exit is anything that restricts the ability of incumbent firms to redeploy their assets from one market to another. If it is costly to exit a market, then this constitutes a barrier to entry in the first place, since if entry is risky, firms will be concerned about recovering the value of their investments if the market becomes turbulent and they need to exit. This makes hit and run entry, much favoured by William Baumol in his contestable market theory, impossible. There are four types of barriers to exit. These relate to the ownership of specialised and durable assets, the fixed costs of exit, strategic considerations, and government barriers. We'll now consider these in turn. First, we have the ownership of specialised and durable assets. This really revolves around the notion of sunk costs. These are the costs associated with being involved in a particular industry or line of work, but which are largely irrecoverable if the firm subsequently decides to exit the industry. In many industries, production involves the use of assets which are highly specific to the job they're intended. For example, a chemical factory or a nuclear power station, or even acquiring a license to drive and operate a taxi service. On exit, there is limited ability for firms to convert such equipment into cash, since such assets have few customers. If the market is in decline, then selling off such equipment may be especially difficult. Other barriers to exit include the fixed costs associated with, say, labour settlements, such as redundancy and pension payments, or accountancy and lawyers' fees, or servicing of customers after exit, for instance with spare parts or making good guarantees, and compensation for breaking any long-term supply contracts. Knowing that these type of costs exist if you exit the market means that you are less inclined to enter the market in the first place. A firm may also have to consider its wider strategy if it has to exit a market, and again this can constitute a barrier to exit. If a line of business constitutes part of a wider business strategy, then pulling out of it could have wider strategic implications for the firm. For instance, by becoming a smaller organisation, the firm may lose purchasing power and/or bulk buying opportunities for particular inputs, or it may lose the use of shared facilities and production synergies, or may not be able to meet all of its customers' needs. For example, Mitsubishi have recently announced plans to pull out of the UK and European car markets, which will have implications for car parts and servicing of vehicles for their customers. But such a decision could have even wider implications for the company's global reputation. Some other examples are also given on the slide. There may also be government barriers to exit. For instance, governments, whether national or regional, may have provided firms with inducements to set up operations in particular regions. Historically, this has been the case with regards to governments seeking to attract foreign direct investment. Such inducements may have been direct subsidies or favourable access to particular land sites. But these inducements are likely to come with conditions attached to them, which require the firm to hold a minimum tenure. Again, this will constitute a barrier to exit. As we have seen, there are several types of barriers to entry and exit that provide incumbent firms with an advantage and enable them to earn a supernormal profit in the long run. However, incumbent firms will also try and erect entry barriers or deter entry through strategic entry deterrence, i.e., they will actively seek to manipulate the market and deter entry. Sometimes, incumbent firms create barriers to entry which are really consistent with or part of their ordinary profit maximising behaviour. For example, firms may engage in product differentiation or cost reduction exercises. The extra loyalty created, however, does increase the hurdles that entrants have to overcome. These extra barriers are in essence innocently raised. Yet alternatively, firms may make strategic decisions that are designed to affect the decisions of potential entrants. This strategic behaviour typically involves the incumbent firm incurring extra costs in the short run to prevent entry, to enable them to earn above normal profits in the long run. There are numerous ways in which incumbent firms engage in strategic entry deterrence. The main three are joint cost raising, investment in excess capacity, and predatory pricing. We'll now consider these in turn. The joint cost rating story involves the incumbent firm taking a variety of additional costly measures that also forces potential entrants to incur extra costs, which essentially make it non-profitable for them to enter. This can be achieved in a variety of ways, through, for example, the incumbent engaging in dirty tricks, or raising switching costs, or increasing input costs, or raising the cost of product improvement. With dirty tricks, the incumbent firm tries to convince consumers that its new rival's products are inferior or even unsafe. If you've seen the recent film The Current Wars, you will have come across a classic example. This involved two of the most famous inventors and entrepreneurs in history, Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse, and led to the invention of the electric chair. During the 1880s, there was a race to supply New York with electric power. The Edison General Electric Company, founded by Thomas Edison, established themselves with a direct current service. Direct current, or DC for short, flows in one direction, and for it to function properly, it relied upon thick copper electric cables. And at the time, copper prices were rising, so the direct current service was limited by not being able to supply customers beyond a few miles of the generator, and it was also very costly. George Westinghouse, with his inventor Nikola Tesla, instead developed alternating current and started the Westinghouse Corporation. Alternating current was a more flexible technology since it reverses the current direction in a circuit at regular intervals. It was also cheaper and served more consumers. However, Edison and his engineer Harold Brown started a smear campaign to suggest that alternating current was unsafe. Indeed, they held public demonstrations, setting up alternating current generators and testing it on animals to show it was unsafe. Similar experiments were done using direct current generators, showing animals were tortured but not killed. At this time, the New York legislature were looking for a more humane form of execution, hanging being deemed to be particularly cruel. Edison lobbied for electrocution as a more modern method, and for alternating current to be used to demonstrate it was lethal. Indeed, Edison and Brown provided alternating current generators for the very first electric chairs. On the 6th of August 1890, convicted murderer William Kemmler was the first person to take a seat in what became known as Old Sparky. Accordingly, the execution didn't go well, and Westinghouse funded the appeals of future prisoners on the grounds of the electric chair being a cruel and unusual punishment. Nevertheless, Old Sparky became the USA's prime method of execution in the 20th century, and in some states is still being used. Of course, alternating current was the superior technology, and is still used today. Years later, Thomas Edison admitted this was the case all along. However, Edison's dirty tricks put the rollout of alternating current back by several years. There have been more recent examples of dirty tricks, notably involving British Airways and Virgin with regard to transatlantic flight routes. You can read the full details on the links provided. Another form of strategic entry deterrence is for an incumbent firm to raise or create switching costs. Examples here include consumer reward schemes, such as the Nectar card or Tesco's Club card. In each case, these reduce the likelihood of consumers switching to new rivals. Alternatively, the incumbent could seek to raise the industry's input costs by, say, paying higher wages for skilled workers, or gaining control of key raw materials or other key inputs. For example, in the UK, telephone lines and communications infrastructure are owned and maintained by British Telecom. However, British Telecom are required by law to lease their use to rival firms, such as TalkTalk or Virgin Media. If this part of the industry was unregulated, British Telecom would likely charge an uncompetitive price to rivals for leasing the line. Such practices can deter entry. Similarly, raising the cost of product improvement or raising industry standards can deter new entry. Indeed, in sectors such as pharmaceuticals and the car industry, firms have long lobbied regulators for tougher regulations and standards, which has the effect of deterring new entry. Excess capacity refers to the ability of incumbent firms to increase their production operations in the face of new entry. It is required if an incumbent firm wishes to fight a price war when a new firm enters the marketplace. In response to the new entry, the incumbent firm increases its production, which has the effect of reducing price and hitting industry profits. Hence, by merely signalling to new potential entrants that it holds excess capacity, the incumbent firm is warning that entry is likely to be matched by aggression, and therefore entry will not be profitable. We have traditionally thought about excess capacity in terms of productive capacity, but we might also think of it in terms of the capacity to engage in advertising and product proliferation. Robert Smiley's classic article from 1988 summarises some of the key forms of excess capacity. In recent years, predatory pricing and predation have gained a lot of attention. A firm engages in predatory pricing by first lowering its price below average cost in order to drive rivals out of business or to deter entry, and then raising prices when exit has occurred and the threat of re-entry has receded. This involves the intertemporal substitution of profits. The idea is that a firm may be willing to incur a loss in the short run, providing it has big pockets, but it can make excessive profits in the long run if entry is deterred. Building up a reputation as being a tough competitor is very important here. In order for a firm to engage in predation, several conditions need to be in place. First, there must be a high degree of interdependence between the firms, i.e., if you lower your price, it will affect your rival's sales. The classic examples are bus routes and airlines, and these are the industries where complaints have been lodged about predatory behaviour. For example, in the 1980s and 1990s, Stagecoach was repeatedly accused of engaging in predatory pricing on bus routes in the north of England. On routes where it faced competition, it would cut prices and then subsequently raise them when the entrant had left the market. Second, the firm must have big or deep pockets and is able to sustain losses in the short run, and these losses can be quite heavy. Finally, a note about welfare. It is clear that consumers will benefit from low prices in the short run, but they will lose out in the long run as entry is deterred or the new entrant is forced out of the market and competition is negated and price will eventually be raised. Does predation work? Theoretically, with low entry barriers, predation should not work, since firms can costlessly exit during unprofitable periods, i.e. during periods of predation, and enter again when prices rise. This is known as hit-and-run entry. However, as we have argued, entry is rarely costless, and in industries such as airlines or bus routes, cycles of exit and entry can earn you a bad reputation among consumers for being unreliable. Predatory pricing is also anti-competitive behaviour and can be punished by the competition authorities. But can it be proved? Is a low price predatory, or does it reflect low costs or competitive pressures? Some cases have been successfully proved. In 2008, for example, Amazon offered free shipping to customers which violated French predation laws. Amazon was subsequently issued with a heavy fine. For those interested, there is some reading that accompanies this session. There is probably something in your textbook on entry barriers, and there are some additional notes we placed on Moodle. There is also a really interesting study by Robert Smiley from 1988 which is quite accessible. The other papers relate to airlines and are for general interest.